Okay, hello everyone. I'm here with Michael Brooks, who is a a writer with me at Zer0 Books, the author of Against the Web. We're here today to talk a little bit about the IDW and Brooks's conception of cosmopolitan socialism, which is a really cool new idea, drawing from people like Amartya Sen and Mark Fisher, that a lot of us think might be the next big thing in kind of hip left circles. So. Thank you very much, Michael, and thanks a lot for coming on the Zer0 channel.
Hey, it's my pleasure, and I'm a big fan of your work, so it's great and feels kind of long overdue, and really good to be talking with you.
Yeah, I felt the same. You know, I've always figured we should be doing something together, and
definitely.
Yeah, COVID's a bitch, but at least it gives me a chance to kind of reach out to some people that normally I wouldn't be able to because life gets in the way.
Right.
So let's get a move on. So your book is pretty readable and accessible. It's slender, about 80 pages. There's a lot crammed into there, right? There you go, Against the Web. I read an e-version, so I don't have a fancy thing to bring up. But you kind of ranked the figures of the IDW in a very interesting way. And the conception I got of the book is you dealt with the ones that you thought were the most serious first, excepting Dave Rubin, who's kind of the butt of a lot of jokes throughout the text. And then you gradually move to the ones who are less serious. And we'll tackle each of the big figures in turn. But first off, why did you decide to write a book about the IDW? What drew you to commenting on this?
You know, there's probably two big strains in this book. And one, and the cosmopolitan socialism thing, is that's where that's the kind of passion. I think there is something really useful and distinctive about that framework. And I think it builds, you mentioned some people, but, also Adolph Reed and Cornel West. And I mean, I think it's a model that is building off of the best that we've got, and is also authentically global in a way most of these conversations are actually incredibly not, even as there is a huge amount of conversation around identity and diversity, which are obviously important, but those are very, it's always done in a highly Americanized discourse. So one element of this book, I think, was trying to find a specific kind of case study and testing ground for putting forward this cosmopolitan framework that I think I've been sort of stumbling around creating, and the closer I've gotten to putting it together in my head has definitely meant that my work has gotten, better, and hopefully improved. The specific thing with the IDW, I mean, really goes back to, again, I mean, honestly, just being, I'm not even trying to be pejorative here, but I mean, just being for, basically for several years, just sort of toiling as an internet nobody, kind of commenting on politics. And, as a backup mic and producing and whatever, and seeing, the sort of pipelines of, I would say in my terminology, generally speaking, right-wing thought on the internet. And the first preoccupation with me is definitely Sam Harris.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
as somebody,
the biggest chapter of the book, I'd say.
Yeah, and I think Sam Harris is, probably the most kind of, he's got maybe I don't know if I would actually say depth, but he has, or certainly not range, but he's got the longest, sort of public intellectual track record. And I think a profile that, certainly for several years was well beyond the scene in terms of the respect he was getting. And I, he was, so that was the sort of, and very specifically, it was like seeing, especially with Harris, that it wasn't just that people were using, it wasn't just that he was a conduit to what I would say would be right-wing thought or, center-right thought, but also that he was very particularly almost like an enemy intellectually of historical understanding. And of course, I think historical understanding is the way, that's the process that we're going to figure anything out. I mean, obviously we're in an intellectual environment now where, that sort of historicizing is actually kind of under assault from almost like every quarter, essentially, But those were the two kind of bases of the book.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would say, historicizing is under assault today in no small part because the political right is desperate to retreat from many different forms of complexity that exist in our world today, back to these kind of nostalgic narratives about logic and progress and the value of Western civilization. And Harris is really emblematic of that. So before we get to him, because I'm sure you got a lot more to say on that topic, what about Dave Rubin? Rubin is kind of one of the figures that you skirt around talking about throughout the book, mostly because you don't really like him all that much and you don't really think that there's much there. And having read his book recently and reviewed it for Jacobin, I can say that I agree with you 100%. There's not there. But just briefly, what are your thoughts on Rubin? And why does he kind of get nothing that you said about this guy, it's a bit of a joke or clown, and then you move on?
Well, I was trying to look at, I guess, both, in their own terms, in terms of sort of waging a critique of these guys, looking at what were the strongest example, who are the strongest members of this group, right? Like you wouldn't hopefully, that's sort of what Jordan Peterson does, right? Except he doesn't even attack Marxists, because the people he says are Marxists are not even really Marxists, but that's his sort of thing is, it's like, hey, let's pick, somebody with like a bad take on Twitter and sort of mount a whole, infrastructure of understanding around that. So I didn't want to do that. And so, Rubin is just not, he's got nothing to him. He really is kind of comically sort of wafer thin. I think the only thing that was funny about him as just a comedic sort of opportunity was that he really had this, and does have this, incredible fusion of, what seems to me is, like, my interpretation is very obvious opportunism and careerism combined with, being like a very genuinely dim-witted guy. Just not, and sort of, so, I think, again, there was a period with him where, even though the whole thing was nonsense, he actually was building a brand as a kind of like space of good-natured intellectual inquiry. I think that stuff has been very complicated since. And maybe honestly, even there, I'm really also trying to deal with in the book all of the just innumerable failings of the left and how these guys get a foothold. So maybe even there was a period of time where, if you're kind of like scrolling around the internet, it has the aesthetic of a sort of, hey, let's just talk about ideas, have a neutral presentation. But, first of all, that was never the case. There's very few, forums like that. Joe Rogan gets a lot closer, in terms of like whatever your view of the guy is. That show is pretty, I actually think it does have a very clear politics in a way. And I think he is much closer to what like the actual center is today, than a lot of people understand. And that has implications for how we, think strategically about politics. And I also think, the fact that he does so much, and this relates to Peterson, that just really is about life hacks and personal meaning and stuff like that, which again is actually very important and should not be dismissed, is significant. But Rubin, he was sort of comically full of shit. Then there was that thing, and it didn't make it into the book because whatever, but several months ago where he sort of had a breakdown because, Quillette, which was doing its own sort of brand maintenance, there was clearly a time when some people in this scene recognized that, this was really hurting the brand, right? Like, we're about rigor and intellectual inquiry. And then we have this, complete dimwit who, hosts all sorts of like extreme far right figures, doesn't, has the same 3 points about college campuses that is his only response to any, you could ask him about arms control, and the next thing you know, he'd be talking about college students. I think it became kind of an embarrassment.
Yeah, you have Stefan Mullen or Lauren Southern across the table from you, and you're peddling them not even softball questions, but all but sitting there. It's like, well, tell me what's good about your fascist doctrines or your reactionary ideas, right?
And that it's almost like they're like these really just insidious figures that he gave these completely positive platforms to, where it was almost like they were more cognizant of the sort of double games you have to play of getting that message out, and he just like, hey, so and so but I think ultimately the point of the book, and there is comedy in it, there is some entertainment value hopefully, but I wanted to work to this cosmopolitan socialism thing, and I wanted to see the ways in which what these guys are putting forward is going to exist beyond them. I mean, already that term feels like something very clearly out of a couple of years ago, although they all retain very significant platforms, but that it wasn't just a book of it wasn't just sort of like one of those like right-wing books you could get at Walmart or something, where it's just like the Michael Brooks guide to these fucking idiots. I mean, there's a little bit of that, but I wanted to facilitate a bigger argument and worldview. And so Ruben, it's just like, how many times can you win the first round of the US Open, no matter how fun it is.
Yeah, no. When I read his book, there was one argument and one argument alone. This is Don't Burn, this book, that I kind of agreed with, which is that sometimes the vampire castle left, if you want to call it that, that's a reference in your book to Mark Fisher, goes a little bit too far, or kind of represents the rest of us badly. And we'll touch on this at the end. The one important fact I learned, though, is that if Dave Rubin had a vagina, it would be a huge vagina. Because apparently if they reconstruct that, they use the original tissue that's there. So for those of you who haven't read Rubin's book, that's an important tidbit of information you'll find out there.
Oh my God.
So moving on to somebody a little bit more impressive, Sam Harris, right?
Yeah.
Like you, I have a lot of respect certainly for Sam Harris's credentials. I know nothing about psychometrics or neurology or anything like that. And I trust that he probably knows what he's talking about, at least in those fields. And he is also a little bit more of a long-term figure than many others in the IDW. I think I first heard of him back in like mid-2000s, maybe, as part of the atheist movement. So I was just been coming out of high school when a lot of this was really gaining traction. And he seems to have rebranded himself to a certain extent as a critic of PC culture, the left, advocating for reason and logic against these crazy identity politics movements. And you deal with him pretty thoroughly through the book. Again, criticizing him for his lack of historicism, for his insensitivity towards issues that we really should be attentive to. So why all this time devoted to Harris? And I guess two questions following that. What do you think Harris gets right, and why do you think he gets so much wrong?
Well, it's funny because I actually, in some ways, I think some of Harris's preoccupations and obsessions are more legitimate than I may have at one point, right? So like, I really do, I think there's so many aspects of what's called the left that is really like, unstrategic and disastrous. So, but the thing is like, what does he get right? I mean, he suggests that people meditate. I think that's a good idea. I think even where he's getting things, quote unquote, right, it is an assertion of such a absolutely impoverished and egotistical worldview that in fact, it even undermines, I think the capacity of some people to try to, address some of the problems that he points to. And I think ironically, and I'll get more specifically, but to him, but I think what's funny is I think that there's a whole bunch of discourses that, and they're not all the same in terms of worth. I think, as toxic and as ridiculous as a lot of the woke stuff is, particularly online or in campuses, it still is preoccupied with, very, very real and urgent problems. That's going to put it a leg ahead or a step above. But on a narrative structure level, I mean, I don't, there's just constant symmetry here. It's like there are bad people, they believe bad things, those bad things must be expunged by either, quote unquote, logic and reason, or by, checking and recognizing. I mean, these are all politics that are purely taking place at the kind of level of projections about interiority and belief, and then almost like rituals of speech and presentation. And Harris is exactly this. I mean, I hear him say logic and reason like infinitely more than I hear him actually deploying those tools, right? So so
to that also, actually, I think the opening chapter in his book must have included references to reason and logic and facts 10 times, right? It's practically a mantra at this point,
It's a mantra. And so I don't know like what exactly that means. I mean, I do know as an example when he starts to talk about, I mean, his latest episode responding to the uprisings. I mean, one, he, misreads and does not understand and see the totality and does not address certain facts for sure. He also simply just has such the guy is unironically in 2020 talking about black on black crime, this just, racist trope that was just like logically debunked by like, Chris Rock. Like, what do you mean? Like you can go to drive to another neighborhood to commit, like, it was this whole, anyway. So I think the thing with Harris though, that really compelled my interest was he, and maybe also shows where some of my politics, diverge. So first I was, got exposed to his work because of his stuff about Islam. And I was very oriented in that stuff. I studied in Turkey. I majored in international relations. I spent a lot of time around this stuff. So, and of course I had and still have some of the so-called politically correct like objections. I think making sweeping statements about a massive part of the world population is insensitive and stupid and absolutely could be categorized as bigoted, and so on. But it even more kind of analytically deeply than that, it was like, this is just an insane way of trying to understand such serious, real complex issues, like even by the way, if you weren't, I always use this example of people who absolutely don't have my politics, like maybe they are, maybe they are connected as an example to like the national security state, and they are interested in quote unquote advancing US interests in the region, unquote, right? They would never for an instant say like, oh yeah, well, you can tell what's going on in Libya because you saw one Gallup poll and you took like a couple of inflammatory passages from a holy book. So it was just this whole terrain, which of course had major stakes in terms of the, a quote unquote war on terror, which is leading to millions, or I would say cumulatively, if we include the invasion of Iraq, the Afghanistan occupation, and the drone programs and, secret warfare that has expanded, from Yemen to the Horn of Africa to Pakistan. We're talking about conservatively over 1 million civilian deaths, a global torture program, a complete, a massive erosion of civil liberties, and then the aggressive surveillance of populations. So yeah, these and instead of saying we need to understand the relationship that developed between, as an example, the Mujahideen, Pakistani intelligence, the CIA, and the Saudi funding sources in the 1980s in order to get to where we are today. I mean, just the real conversations. And his response was to dismiss basically any historicism as just sort of so much left-wing political correctness. Then, you know, and I think, again, it reveals broader philosophical problems, like the lack of ability to distinguish between is and ought, the idea that empirical science can somehow, you know, kind of provide a full moral map of life. And then, you know, to kind of put a button on it, obviously, a couple of years ago, he felt, you know, a passionate need to defend, you know, Charles Murray. And
everybody's favorite person, right?
Everybody's favorite person. And, you know, again, first, and the thing that's so disgusting about the bell curve is, of course, absolutely, it's a racist tract. It's also a class justification tract. It's literally saying that, you know, because we've, you know, done a bunch of, you know, we're looking at all these psychometric tests, and we're saying that in the so-called information economy that basically only smart people will perform well, and, you know, there's nothing you can do about it. And of course, again, you know, this is the classic two-step. It's 100% a racist tract. And it's also clearly the product of a guy who's been in think tanks for decades, looking to blame the poor and working class, make sure we don't have a social safety net and everything else. And, you know, Sam Harris didn't say on his podcast, hey, there's a lot of critiques of Charles Murray. This isn't really my area. You know, what, or even just nothing at all, but hey, I don't like how he was protested in Middlebury. Fine. He felt a need to call a guy, you know, to say he was a martyr, which, by the way, in this case, you can very clearly distinguish between the specific questions of how you handle his speaking engagements at college campuses, which, again, I agree with Noam Chomsky on that sort of stuff. But on the other hand, I mean, the idea, like, this guy has been amply rewarded financially. I mean, the idea that he has been somehow brought out of public life is it just absolutely delusional, and shows the kind of petty nature of Harris's, you know, obsessions. And then that it all culminated in, you know, basically uncritically accepting, you know, of course, the most reactionary version of the IQ stuff, not looking at Turkheimer as an example, who's in the field and has a very different view of this, who is actually in the field. Of course, Harris dismissed him, even though, like, he's a subject area expert. And then, you know, not even getting to, frankly, where, you know, look, we're at least where I'm at, which is that I don't think, you know, these tests are inseparable from their political and social trajectories and histories. And as Nassim Taleb actually demonstrated, like, where they measure things, they're probably self-evident, in the sense that, you know, if somebody really does have some type of innate cognitive barrier, we don't necessarily need an IQ test to measure that. And then sort of beyond that, what exactly are we really measuring here? And there's all the enormous toxic social effects of it. But at any rate, in that exchange that Harris had with Ezra Klein, he had this line where he said, the history is irrelevant. And to me, that just distilled everything. And that was what I wanted to address in the chapter to the book. And, you know, the history is always relevant. I'll just go on, you know, 1 5-second tangent. I'll shut up. But, like, you know, and now it's becoming almost too fashionable, but yes, there's this new disastrous white fragility book. That's the big, like, middle class woke bullshit. And it's like, you know, I know this is harder, but, you know, read Walter Rodney, like, read a fucking book, you know, don't, like, get into the history, get into the context of where we are and why. And that's so lacking in our culture. And Sam Harris has made it his business to make that problem worse and basically sort of, you know, I would say justify that problem. So that was what I wanted to answer in that book, from the naturalization of hierarchy and racism to the ideas on Islam and foreign policy, that this is a aggressive dehistoricization, which is, you know, strips away the fundamental building blocks of any real intellectual effort.
Yeah, I mean, just to respond to your little comment about Murray, which is something I've noticed about a lot of these IDW people, right? I agree with Noam Chomsky as well. I think we should allow them to speak. We should debate them on their own terms, and we should show why their ideas are crap, right? But what I often say whenever I hear this kind of martyr stuff is, fuck, sign me up. I want to be a martyr, right? I want a lucrative book contract. I want a fucking position at, a think tank. I want millions of dollars a year.
Absolutely.
And this is martyrdom, I'll be there in a few seconds, right?
Absolutely. Well, yeah, I know. I mean, in that case, and in the case of those types of things, it's just, I mean, the level of kind of whining and self-victimization is just, and it's all, yeah, I mean, it's extraordinary. And it doesn't, I think Robert Wright pointed out that another kind of element of Sam Harris is like, he clearly has his own, fairly narrow, but like profoundly deeply held identity politics, but he doesn't have the kind of capacity he doesn't have any observational viewpoint to kind of, to interrogate them in any way.
No, and he's a clever public speaker. I don't think anybody wouldn't give him that, right? He knows how to make pithy statements really well that sound analytically precise and even convincing, right? Except, of course, as you mentioned, when you start to historicize them and actually look at the complexities of the world, particularly around Islam, you realize that a lot of it's a crock of shit, right? I mean,
yeah, and the race, and the IQ stuff, and again, I never, and I'll confess, I mean, you always have to look in yourself why somebody irritates you so much. So I would absolutely confess that the guy, I've really had those moments where it's like, this fucking guy is so annoying. But even stepping back from that, I mean, no, like, of course he's not stupid. And of course he's got, I think the ability to sort of speak in these uninterrupted paragraphs is obviously very, very, there is a certain presentational weight to them. But I mean, no, I don't like, is the quality of the thinking really that deep? I mean, no, it's absolutely not. And I'm not, before people kind of rush, I'm not suggesting that mine is. I'm suggesting, let's really stack this up against, say an Adolf Reed, I mean, or, in a very different terrain. But like, to understand anti-essentialism as a concept, I mean, that requires some real precision. That requires some case studies. That requires some awareness. And so, you would get these big sort of sweeping block paragraphs, which the other, would basically just sort of validate, the prevailing biases of the audience that would be consuming these things anyways. I mean, sure, maybe there was some, liberal people who were, couldn't believe that you would talk that way about Islam or whatever. Sure. There's always, but that's like, that's your aunt or your, your cousin or niece at the dinner table that you're disagreeing with. There was nothing in that writing that really questioned, anything. Cause I don't think the base of those books, I mean, I know that he's helped exit some people from religious fundamentalism, but it's certainly, I could tell you, anecdotally, I mean, most people I know who read that stuff, they didn't have to contend with fundamentalism, and everything else was just sort of like, be a modern middle class rationalist. And basically the United States is good. Basically there's no problem. We've got to look out for terrorists and college students. And, that's about it.
Oh yeah, 100%. It's just anecdotally, coming back to your comment about people who irritate you, right? I met a lot of people who used to read and revere Sam Harris. And there's always something that irritated me about them, right? So it's kind of ironic that we're having this conversation right now. At least when they were talking about them, not always personally, right? And I think one of the things about this whole logic and reason thing is it really rewards the audience for agreeing with him, right? Because you invoke logic and reason like a mantra or a trope.
Right.
And then somebody listens to you and you think, well, I'm logical and reasonable and I'm certainly better than all of them over there in that, weird part of the world where they're dangerous fundamentalist people. So I'm just going to kind of buy into this whole network and not really criticize it or historicize it the way that we should, right?
Right.
That brings me actually to my next question, which is about everybody's favorite Canadian psychologist. And just to do a bit of a plug and my own bias here, I co-authored a book on Jordan Peterson with Ben Burgess and Marion Trejo and a few others. But you have a big chapter on him.
Yes.
Particularly where you take him to task for mystification and some of the really odd stuff that you find if you delve deeply enough into his writing. So what are your thoughts on Peterson? Why did he appeal to so many people? I think that's the first thing a lot of us would want to know. And what is the big problem, particularly with his take on the left and his arguments for this kind of ordered liberty conservatism is what I call it, but you might have a different.
Right. Well, I mean, I actually had a lot more sympathy in a way with what Peterson was appealing to than Harris. You know, like I could say actually I watched both Sam Harris and Jordan Peterson on Russell Brand. I used to watch Russell Brand regularly, and then I guess his podcast went behind a paywall or something, which, you know, I should just pay for it, but I haven't yet. And but I used to watch a fair amount of his interviews on YouTube. I enjoy Russell Brand, and you know, it was interesting because in the Peterson case, if you have these interests, spiritual interests, questions about personal meaning. I mean, certainly Harris is a promoter of mindfulness and meditation. I actually think, funnily enough, I think Sam and I actually share a mindfulness meditation teacher, which is pretty ironic. But I think that Peterson speaks to serious questions that people have about lack of meaning, searching for purpose. And I think those are real things. I think that he definitely was meeting needs around alienation, needs around pain and separation, probably particularly around young men. And I would say, you know, that is Scott Atran, who is, you know, in some senses, one of my alternatives to Peterson, although he's not. I mean, he's a very serious academic anthropologist and, you know, in no way a self-help guru, but he does ethnographies on terrorism and looks at what he calls sacred values and meaning and, you know, basically like what can lead the factors behind primarily young men, whether we're talking about the alt-right or a terrorist group but also on the other hand, maybe actually, you know, a liberation group, what can lead them to these things? And he makes, you know, there's no apology about it, that the challenge, you know, for young men is very real, even if they're quote unquote relatively privileged, you know, as they are in some ways. But, you know, again, that privilege discourse comes up short extremely quickly. And so I think he was speaking to those needs. And then, you know, the problem is, you know, obviously a very strong disagreement on, you know, rights and respect and equity around gender and various gender identities, obviously, and how he kind of cynically exploited his own sort of hysteria around that to gin up his own career would be my interpretation of that. And then, you know, and that's the area where, you know, look, to be fair, there really is just a disagreement. We have fundamental disagreements around those things, right? Like the rights and equity and dignity of trans people as an example, and whether or not, you know, look, you can have a critique and, you know, of anything, right? But you should definitely treat your fellow human beings with decency and respect. And, you know, certainly interpersonally as best you can. And then obviously in the realm of rights and legality, to me, there's just no debate about what must happen. Then I think the other big problem was actually taking it in his own terms, which is, okay, let's try to disaggregate between some of the reactionary stuff and some of the things that I think everybody's experiencing and is relevant. I think a lot of people do, even separated from any sort of reactionary, you know, kind of outlook. A lot of people would like a much greater sense of continuity in their lives. They would like to, you know, be able to live in the town they grew up in. They would like to be able to have stronger family and community bonds. I mean, these are real desires. These are real things. And I actually think, you know, the left dismisses them or writes it all off as reactionary, again, just incorrectly and at its own peril. So what Peterson then does is, you know, after, you know, blaming feminists and trans people and you know, beating up on various you know, marginalized people seeking rights in a society, he then goes and basically, seeks to naturalize the primary force that is disrupting people's capacity to live those lives. So that even in, and because if you look at politics, I sort of do with like, say, three kind of bases of like, let's say, not really in this sense, but let's say at the base, we need universal public provisions. Every single human being needs and can have food, healthcare, housing. And without those substantive realizations, liberal rights are a joke, right? Then on a sort of second wave, we make sure that in an open society and in a democracy that everyone has full equity in legal and civic sphere, and we eliminate anything that jeopardizes that along lines of race or gender identity. And then on the sort of like cultural sphere, this is actually the time to be laissez-faire. It doesn't like let people live the lives they see fit. People will have completely different relationships to, how they want to live, where they want to live, how they want to associate. There's going to be certain, certain scenes that are going to have like, in some ways like extremely conservative rituals around dating as an example, but then also like be into polyamory or something. And other people are not going to want, maybe they want to have more traditional dating, but they think polyamory is fucking weird. And the point is like all of that stuff should be safe and accessible to all in a context where nobody is discriminated against and nobody's economically emiserated, period, full stop. And then people, I think, can actually kind of naturally and organically, form some of those contexts they want to create for themselves. And I really actually truly believe like in a broader democratic meshwork, you need to let people have a lot of freedom in terms of how they want to constitute those things for themselves. That's something that shouldn't be prescribed or controlled in any way. And so, and I think that that's important. And I think that Peterson is, it's not only morally wrong because of how he treats and talks about people, but it's also just, it's analytically ludicrous to say that you as like a young, yes, like sure, maybe yes, there's different changing social norms or whatever, sure. But the bottom line is that the primary obstacle that you have to, getting on with your life are these economic policies. There's just no question about that. And I want to, I want to be careful because I think sometimes we can evade the actual argument that's being had and say, well, no, what you're really talking about is X. And I think that's a problem. But at the same time, in this instance, what you're really talking about is X. And he's got no prescription for X other than to valorize the market. So it becomes a totally kind of an incoherent stew.
Yeah, no, I think you're exactly right. And actually, we pointed that out in the book. Each of us in our different ways numerous times. Like, nobody's going to sit there and say self-help is a bad thing, right? If you need to work on yourself, you've got serious problems with your personal life, you should, by all means, try to take care of them. In some senses, it might be your first responsibility, right? You should keep your room clean, right? If you think that you need to improve, go out there, start hitting the gym, eat better, find some friends who are better for you. All that's good stuff, right? The problem comes when you say things, for me at least, like, put your own house in order before you try to change the world. Because sometimes your life might very much be in disorder because the world's a fucked up place, right?
Absolutely. Of course.
If you're sitting there at McDonald's earning $10 an hour, right? You can't pay your rent, you have to take a second job, and it's unlikely that you're even going to be able to apply for something else. Your problem is the fact that our economic system is exploitative and you don't have the kind of quality of life that you need. And the solution to it is to band together with people and to try to change it, right?
Absolutely. And even there, it's so, I agree. I mean, and it's also just so ridiculous because it's like the idea that, Cabral, Malcolm X, these people weren't trying to sort of like in the large and fully properly understood sense, clean their room. I mean, it's ludicrous. And the idea, and it's funny enough, because sometimes you see this, I guess, on the, some people on the left kind of might discount the importance of sort of like subjective experience and interiority, but the idea that it's not all of the above and that these things aren't all operating at once is just absolutely ludicrous. And, and again, he didn't, even there was also this incredible contradiction, right? Because, he didn't shoot to fame with a sort of like secular Jehovah's Witness, like, don't even ask me about the presidential election because I'm still working on myself. Like there was the idea of, I mean, he scrapped it, but he had some idea of like monitoring college professors, which reminded me of like kind of like David Horowitz, McCarthyite type of stuff. So even there, and Zizek, pointed this out very well in the debate. It's like, what do you think you're doing? And it's not to, and so, yeah. So even there, it was ludicrous. And I wish, but that's also just the sort of nature of today's world, like somebody's saying like, hey, what is the relationship between like your inner psychology and what you're fighting for in the world? That might be worth reflecting on. That's probably true and not going to get you sold out speaking tour across the Western Hemisphere.
Oh, 100%. One of the most frustrating emails that I get from people is they commented on our book, right? And they're like, oh, don't you realize he's just a psychologist. He's just trying to help people. Why do you have to make it political? And I'm like, look, I'm not the one who came out against a bill concerning trans rights.
Exactly.
No,
that is the most disingenuous bullshit. I mean, that really, and I think especially from people like us on the left, where we would not mandate, like, if he really was speaking narrowly, I would be, I'm curious what everybody has to say about various things because I care about this stuff, but there would be zero expectation. And in fact, I know that there, for a fact, like I sometimes listen to Rabbi Sachs, who's the former chief rabbi of the UK. Terrible politics in key areas, but his, some of his lectures and teachings are enormously moving and powerful, and he's got a real scholasticism and authority to them. And so it's not even like I need it to be every which way at all, but the idea, but it's so, that was the other part of it. And I got into it less in the book. You guys did, but just the stunning disingenuity of, like, the reason you're in the public sphere is because you won't respect people's pronouns. You do this whole fucking temper tantrum about an equity bill, which, and even when people say, no, it's not about the equity, it's about the speech, like, look, okay, then make it about that, right? But comparing yourself to Solzhenitsyn and all of this stuff, like that's why we're here. So yeah, I always found when people did that, that was just, and that was also another very weird thing that kind of shows up across the board in this scene, where it's like this kind of constant sniping. And then when you get, even with Harris, sometimes there's a lot of like, Sam is just so good. You don't understand. Like, Sam's intention is to help all being, like, cool. Great, and I'm not even discounting that, sure. But like, he got this thing about, Islam disastrously wrong. So we're talking about that,
Yeah, I mean, there's all kinds of bad people through history who had very good intentions, right? I mean, go and read a history book and you'll realize that there's a million prophets out there, all who think that they had the best idea and they did horrible things, right?
Well, and also for what it's worth, I mean, just, and yeah, that's number one. And second, like, probably a lot of the people you're complaining about have some good intentions and think they're trying to help the world. Like, we either need to build that as a basis upon which we relate to each other, and I think probably we should inject more of that into the overall public sphere. Or on the other hand, we should, say, hey, if Jordan isn't going to extend that to some fucking college kids who don't want to experience housing discrimination and don't want a professor to be an asshole to him, then, maybe he's not always going to get back himself.
Oh, and I should say also, if people are looking for somebody who's really good at blending left-wing politics with a real spiritual core, I think Cornel West, who you mentioned in your book a couple times, is really talented at that.
Absolutely.
I always look at people like Paul Tillich or Soren Kierkegaard, but Cornel has this kind of extraordinary, prophetic way of talking about things, while he's also talking about Hegel and poverty and Brother Sanders and stuff, right? Really inspiring stuff.
Yeah, and I would also add, I mentioned James Hillman. James Hillman was a brilliant archetypal psychologist. There's Susan Green there. And I think also increasingly people should be looking at, I've been trying to put forward Leonardo Boff, who is a very prominent Brazilian liberation theologian, and he and Matthew Fox were silenced by the church in the 80s when basically literally the CIA was striking deals with the Vatican about we'll work with you on Poland, but we also need to support all of these fascist regimes we're backing throughout Latin America. I think that stuff is important, and I think that that's one thing that even Harris is a totally militant atheist because of the meditation stuff he's speaking towards, and I think we need to be really at peace and open to people's desires to get better. Which it's ironic, because even if you want people to get better as relates to, the things that preoccupy the woke, then you have to allow for that process of getting better. You can't say people are stuck in stone. And I think that kind of broader spiritual realm is definitely connected to that, however you conceive it.
I think so, 100%, right? I mean, reading a lot of that stuff, even if I don't always buy into, let's just call it his metaphysical message, there's a lot of wisdom there, right? And there's a lot of really penetrating stuff. And I don't think you could fault yourself from turning to that. Particularly times right now, right, where there's crises, and a lot of us have these kind of big questions, right? What does it all mean? How are we going to put things back together? Why does the world fall apart sometimes, right? You got to do what you got to do, right?
Absolutely. And you should. Yeah.
You should, yeah. And I wanted to bring on just really quickly, because I want to talk about the last chapter of the book. And I realize we're already going on for a fair long time. The other members of the IDW, right? People like Ben Shapiro, Christina Hoff Sommers. Do you have any last thoughts on them and what they're?
I mean, Ben Shapiro, just not impressive. I think he's a.
Speaks really fast, though.
Sorry?
Speaks really fast, though.
He speaks really fast. He's a standard right-wing talker. His book on the West and Athens and Jerusalem, and somehow there's this tradition that magically skips over Islamic history, even though Islam is like literally the physical like bridge point between some of this, carrying the sort of Greek stuff forward, and even the way he's conceiving of Greece, which is not this purely Western thing. It's Pan-African, it's Pan-Asian, it's, all of that stuff. So, yeah, but, Shapiro's just, he's just a right-wing talker. Christine Hoff Sommers, honestly, I don't think she's in the book. I think she's somebody who, she works at the American Enterprise Institute, right? So she might have had this or that interesting point, but it seems to me that she is just, I just see her like a whack-a-mole just sort of pop up to basically have, she's just sort of the all-consuming, like, I'm a Democrat, but now, and so so that kind of gets boring. Honestly, someone like I find, I don't know, like people really hate her, but like I really enjoy reading Camille Paglia, and
It's funny. I will say this: I read her essay on Foucault.
yeah,
Totally disagreed with it, but I do admit that parts of me were like, "Damn, that is funny."
just great writing. I mean, it's very, of course, I don't agree, and but she's had some, I disagree, agree, but she's like, that's a much more, I don't know. I just don't find Christine Hoff Sommers to have that kind of dynamism, and and at the end of the day, I think, yeah, she's sitting at a far right think tank and kind of turning out those takes. So I don't think we talked about her. I didn't address her, and I don't even think we've talked about her. Like, I don't even think we've ever even done a show segment on her on TMBS. She's certainly not in the book. The Weinstein brothers are probably more relevant now in terms of they're the two who are kind of most closely identified with this label. I honestly, I mean, I think there's a lot of lessons from Evergreen, which you can get into from the book, including, I mean, as one would imagine, I certainly have some critiques of, that type of student activism. On the other hand, I also think that I want to know the bigger picture between there's a book, I cannot recall the title of it, but it really correlated the way that administrations have loved sort of including commitments to very important goals as part of larger austerity pushes, which of course undermine the overall structure of those goals, like making a properly and fully racially, economically diverse campus, stuff that, again, you very much expect from my, Cedric Johnson, Adolf Reed kind of reading of the world. But, those guys, they seem like they've got some views on biology and math, which I'm not the one to comment on. And then it's a lot of other just sort of, we can't say what you want anymore and blah, 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 blah. And, actually the real serious point about this is that, Weinstein went on Tucker Carlson, he testified in front of Congress. And especially just coming off, I just talked with Noam Chomsky, and Noam Chomsky, like, the fact that he actually articulates a substantive view in terms of free speech and does not accept this ridiculous, like, well, if it isn't happening in the public sector, it's fine, like, which unfortunately I think so many liberals are doing today in a way which is ultimately disastrous for the left. But he is a thoroughgoing, anti-censorship, pro-free speech person, and who points out that the only reason that this is even an issue today is because it's happening to the right a little bit after it happened to the left for decades. And the idea that some guy who might have had a bad experience, might have some legitimate, things to complain about, might have some things to talk about, that he went and then was involved in any way with an actual Republican agenda to literally use the state apparatus to monitor academic expression. It's worse than that. I mean, who cares about hypocrisy? It's because everybody's a hypocrite to one degree or another, but it is beyond, it's not just like, ooh, gotcha. That is so pernicious. I wasn't terribly impressed with the bros either.
No, I mean, I think this is actually a good point for us to get into the last two big questions that I have. The first one is a good hard look at the left, which you do give in your book. I think a lot of us feel that, look, a lot of these right-wing accusations that we're opposed to free speech are exaggerated. Anybody who spends any time with the left will know that we love targeting ourselves probably more than we do anyone else. There's a lot of opinions. Not everyone holds to the same kind of thing. But what's the problem then with what I'll broadly call the vampire castle left, which is a term you draw from Mark Fisher's seminal essay on the topic. And Fisher, for those of you who don't know, says, there's this kind of left-wing Twitter mob that has a priest desire to excommunicate and condemn, an academic pedant's desire to be the first one to call out a mistake, and a kind of hipster's desire to be with the in-group. So why did that resonate with you? And what kind of lessons do you think the left needs to learn if it's to avoid living in the vampire castle, let's say?
Yeah. So I think there's sort of three different things that I would draw from definitely the Vampire Castle essay, which unfortunately everybody should still read, because I mean, other than a couple of sort of, time specific examples, it's still pretty much 100% true. Then there's people like Vivek Chibra, who really talked about the kind of fundamental middle class nature of the so-called of the left in the United States. And I think honestly, even things that, I've just seen accelerate to such ridiculous degrees. Now, because even someone like Angela Nagel, she wrote this book. It's a good book. I interviewed her. I talked to her. Then there was this, big effort to destroy her. Then it was like this weird experience because, she put out this article that I had actual disagreements with.
Was this
the immigration piece? I wasn't obsessed with, talking about it. It just wasn't at the forefront of my mind. But then so on the one hand, look, maybe there should have been more talk about it in terms of pushing back. But being in conversations where it's I don't sort of agree with a certain sort of Clinton approach on immigration, but you're actually calling her a Nazi. I mean, this is just this is literal insanity, right? And so, and maybe I think there was, that tendency to either, again, you don't want to get harassed yourself. And then also you don't want to, which I would, I think everybody would cop to, and we all have to kind of build our tolerance level basically. And I think a lot of us have for several years now. And then on the other hand, it was just, that real desire for a long time to be yeah, but this is all just kind of dumb shit on social media. And it is, but it has a real consequence. So anyways, but I think there's three things. I think there's number one.
In there for 1 second and say,
yeah, please.
It absolutely has a real consequence. And I'll just tell you from years and years of teaching in post-secondary institutions, right? I'm a left-wing guy, always have been, right? At least since I was 20. Throughout my whole professional career, I've advocated for left-wing policies. But the number one thing a lot of young people tell me when they say they don't want to join the left is, I found them all really shrill. They were all kind of ultra woke. I couldn't actually express what I wanted to say. And I kind of always thought to myself, because this was men, women, people from a variety of different ethnic backgrounds. These
Absolutely.
People we want to be reaching. You're young, you've got big ideas. Some of them are really smart. This is our crowd, right? And we're losing them. It's not good.
No, and again, that still happens a lot. And
Yeah.
So I think, there's sort of three different, versions of it. So one is just the idea of actually having a serious and robust intellectual culture, because that actually helps. So as an example, and, even this is a great example, yes, Tucker Carlson is absolutely a disgusting racist xenophobe. Now, if just calling him that again and 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 again did the trick, then great, it would do the trick. It's not. So you need to do a real serious analysis of what he's doing and of seeing what he's doing, what it appeals to, and then how to address it strategically. I think, so I think, there is just one part of just genuinely having a serious, robust intellectual environment. Then I think, the other thing is what you were pointing to, which is that all of these insularity and rituals and, in certain places, just sort of extreme kind of cult-like conformity, it just doesn't appeal to most people. And again, we can, my thing is if you want to make, this argument always gets caricatured, that we're always saying okay, so, the left is primarily this academic upper middle class thing. So what we need to do is, just Archie Bunker it up, but have healthcare. Yeah. And that's not the point. I mean, the point is actually, can you be as heterodox and as dynamic and as full across the board as the working class is itself? Yeah. And that means, everything from comfort with ambiguity, recognizing that you're going to work with certain people on certain issues, not on others, recognition in the contradictions that all of us hold. I mean, this is another reason. Again, it's so amazing how annoying people are, because it's not a question of defense. There's tons of things I disagree with Joe Rogan about. Tons. I've done videos on stuff I disagree with the guy about. I also see the obvious ways in which he's an extremely talented and likable broadcaster. Again, that's just the truth. I mean, and you should watch these segments sometimes, because this is a normal person's thought process that will go from like deep, beautiful instincts on an aspect of justice, then enjoying a piece of comedy or a fight, then saying something fucked up, then saying something that maybe you hear is fucked up, but is actually a good point. And you just need to hear it and not, run it through your hyperactive filter bubble.
Yeah,
and so
that person, right?
Exactly. And so I think and then that just sort of leads to the third thing, which is that the truth of the matter is, if you want to build an actual political movement, I just think it can't, you have to both have a hugely wider acceptance in the gradation of beliefs, behaviors, social practices, and draw, much broader but clear lines that are going to be accessible to most people. And I actually think what's great is, I think the good news is I actually think it might be that most people are more quote unquote third way or moderate than the left is, but they're actually not conservative or reactionary. That's another thing too. It's build off of the potentiality there. I mean, if you look at opinion polls and things like that, it's actually there's there's a lot of ground to work off of there, for amongst a lot of people in terms of serious commitments to civic and legal equities, as an example. And so, and then the last thing I would say too is that also, you want to be, and I think this is the kind of double irony that, and it does get back to some of the kind of spiritual stuff, that if you want people to actually genuinely evolve and genuinely change where that might be useful for them to change, then it can't be a process of terrorizing and gossiping and all. It actually has to be an environment that facilitates actual growth, not just change discursive behavior because everybody's paranoid and freaked out, and nobody wants to be part of that. That does not appeal to a vast range of healthy human beings. And again, as we keep emphasizing, of every single background. And so, and I think it ultimately does start to get of what might get you a little juice for some kind of dumb shit on social media or a click is not the same thing that is in any way going to help the infrastructure of having an actual political presence. And, we're still not there yet. And I wish in some ways the kind of focus on, culture and changing people in a certain way, I wish that would get either really spiritualized and really get if you want to take that on, do that kind of work, or on the other hand, get it out of, get it into materiality and real politics. I mean, I'm really stuck on this example of people reading this D'Angelo book instead of reading, Walter Rodney or, whoever. I mean, I could say innumerable examples, but it's just are you fucking kidding me? Get with the real stuff. And it leads into the kind of cosmopolitan thing.
Oh, I think so. And actually, that's my last question. But I just wanted to say, right, one of the reasons I was attracted to progressive politics early on was exactly because I like a lot of people who hold different opinions, who have different kind of lifestyles. I like learning to them. I like going to bars and talking to them about why they do the things that they do. I don't want to live in a vampire castle, right, where everyone feels and talks and does the same kind of thing, right? And sometimes when you get out of that and you deal with other people who hold really different views than you have to have hard conversations, and sometimes those can get a little bit heated. But that's not something we should be afraid of, right? If anything, it adds a lot of richness and texture to your life that I think also has a spiritual dimension, like you're talking about, that's often underappreciated in our kind of simplicity-focused politics, where everything's got to be boiled down to its simplest, most chaste possible form, right? And I do think you can really change people's mind, right? I mean, one of my good buddies is a boilermaker down in Sarnia, Ontario, right? And his dad's a pretty conservative guy, and he was telling me just the other week, his dad changed his mind on a universal basic income because of the corona crisis. And because he's talking to his dad time and time again, and he likes Rogan and all that kind of stuff. And he said, I never thought that would happen, but you know, you do talk to people like people long enough, and maybe sometimes they'll come around. Not all.
Absolutely. And then you also let them, like, you know, just let them be at the same time. Like, look, if somebody, again, it's like if somebody goes out and they say, look, I have a particular set of, say, religious beliefs, and therefore I'm going to go out and agitate to fight against and mitigate the, you know, full civil rights of anybody, then that's just so simple. Like, we've got a political fight in our hands. If somebody said, hey, I understand that in the civic sphere that everybody has equity, in my own sort of internal belief system that I organize some of my social life around, I view it differently. I mean, look, yeah, I probably would have that argument. They would certainly know I disagree. But at the end of the day, like, okay, it just isn't, you know, I think you have to be very careful. And then, you know, another thing, you know, you start like, this person said this in 2012, this person did this in 2015, like, you know, and again, and not like, you know, like just sort of like the petty chronicling of all, like, you could expose any human and all of their frailty and, you know, make them look terrible. That's like the nature of existence. And instead of that, just like basic humility and generosity, basically just being like sort of like toxic, crazed gossip mongers gets confused with politics.
Oh, 100%. I mean, if you fucking took any person and just gave a timeline of all the mistakes they made in life, none of us would look good, right? We would all look like really petty, bad people, right?
We would all look like Tony the Soprano said, Hannibal Lecter. So I think that, yeah, that the, you know, and again, it also represents this other very contradictory strain between, you know, on one hand, opening these enormously important conversations, like, you know, like, yeah, should we abolish prisons? Because the idea on a certain absolutely correct level is like, you might need to have this very small amount of people that are literally like, you know, physically separated because they're actually a danger to others. But in so many cases, like, yeah, or to themselves. And, you know, that's, again, I don't want to get into all of the details of it, but the basic premise, frankly, that like, you know, should we have these violent warehouses just specifically for retribution? No. I remember reading Angela Davis when I was, you know, young and being like, whoa, and it still makes sense to me on that level about like retribution. So then you got to correlate that in the cultural realm. You know, you can't like have this sort of like, hey man, like, you know, and that's another sort of like contradictory approach to the public. Like, on one hand, you're telling me something that might really freak me out about prisons because I don't understand it. And it sounds dangerous and it sounds ridiculous. But then on the other hand, you're saying that, you know, somebody like made a mistake or whatever, and their lives need to be destroyed in the perpetuity. It does not make any sense. You know, it's completely intellectually incoherent and morally incoherent. And so I think that, you know, you got to expand out with that real kind of the empathy and all that entails. And I would say, you know, absolutely, the IDW and folks like that do not embody these practices at all, but they certainly know how to exploit it, you know.
Oh, 100%, right?
Yeah.
Nobody's going to deny that they're skilled showmen. So last question, and then I'll let you go, since I'm sure you got stuff to do this evening.
Hey, this is fun, man. Appreciate it.
Yeah, I agree. cosmopolitan socialism, right? You kind of end the book on this. There have been some people who've criticized you for not elaborating enough. I'm thinking of Samuel Cronin. He's somebody I correspond with every now and then. He actually
Right.
wrote my book. So here's your chance. Can you tell us a little bit more? What's cosmopolitan socialism about? Why do we need it right now? And how can it get the kick in the ass it needs to kind of take off?
Yeah, I actually want to reread Cronin's review, and some of it I think he, either I didn't communicate well enough what I was saying, or he was not understanding what I was saying. I think in other areas there's definitely grounds he pointed to for elaboration, and I think obviously in some ways I'm more optimistic than he is, because as an example, I think he talks about the kind of pull towards nationalism, and I think again this is another thing that if we disaggregate some very obvious things, this might be a lot more manageable. So, to me, do I have a sort of, pull towards a truly kind of global sort of post-national thing? Yeah, of course, in some utopian sense. But I also don't think any, I also think it's a disaster, again, another kind of rhetorical disaster to suggest that any kind of affinity with one's nation state is automatically like fascism, Obviously, that's not true. And I think what a lot of these things are, I think, there's an expression and across a realm of social life and political life to kind of reclaim autonomy that has just been taken out of our hands in so many ways. And I think that this national pull is an element of that. And I think, again, like the left didn't need to run away from that. The left could say, well, we don't, no, yeah, actually, right. We don't want the exclusivist reactionary nationalism. And we certainly want the nationalism of everybody has healthcare. That is a nation state delivering, for a polity. But cosmopolitan socialism to me was just, it is honestly, it is on a very simple axis though, which is that so many arguments that we see today, and actually, there's an interesting parallel now between the right-wing nationalist resurgence and some of the kind of woke standpoint epistemology stuff, which is that everything is in its particulars, whether we're talking about individual, group, or nation. There's nothing that can bind people beyond that all projects of globalization are essentially, projects of the elite, which they often are. Obviously, the globalization that we've undergone is enormously destructive in terms of the types of trade agreements and how we've done it, but not people's actual desire to be part of a global culture. And so I think that, to me, the answer in some respects and what cosmopolitan socialism puts forward, and it is kind of simple, but it has, I think, huge manifestations for how to actually live and conceive of politics, which is that there are universal aspirations in both the kind of material base level. I do have that grubby Marxist, most people are workers and most people don't have power over their economic lives, and most people would very much like that. And there is a universality in that. And you still see that in trade unionism solidarity across the world today. And other related powerful social movements. Then I think there is some shared sense of basic parameters around rights, democracy, expression, and following Amartya Sen. And, he really elegantly laid this out, that this is not a culturally specific thing. And actually Samuel Moyn does this too in his Rights Are Not Enough book, which is a great book, that on one hand, we just complicate the traditional Western narrative of like, with the Greeks, and then they went to we go from Athens to London and then the founders, and, boom, here we are, maybe with a little bit of Torah thrown in if we're Ben Shapiro. And first of all, that's ridiculous. We complicate that history. We recognize that in both the ancient world, Greece and Rome we're already talking about Africa and Asia. And then, we can also globalize and look at and Sen does this so well, and I cited in the book, whether we're talking about Ashoka or unfortunately it's not in the book, but the Ethiopian philosopher Jacob, who was like the sort of precursor of the Enlightenment, arguably, or another thing that didn't make it in the book, but the idea like of which Slavoj Žižek basically following from C.L.R. James, that like the French Revolution doesn't become what it is until the Haitian Revolution happens, because the ultimate test of the actual universality of these things is in the first slave revolt, which is the first global, like true full revolution, in this part of the world, in this hemisphere. So I think it provides, and you can start reading in this way. And I think, there's just ample, whether you're looking at anti-essentialism or reading about colonial struggles, or, really just anybody that put the particularity of their struggle into a comparative context, this is where you go. You see the universality and you see the particulars. And I think, the other big advantage that this has too is that this invites us to actually truly globalize, these conversations, which are going to increasingly happen anyways, right? Like particularly as China rises. And there was an interesting piece that Alex Huckley just wrote for Damage, which is a really good website, kind of like, basically like, why is it that some people, and I think frankly, he's definitely overlooking some things. And I think there is an organic element to the international nature of these uprisings, but there is this other tension of like, why is it that, a local form of police viciousness towards the Roma population didn't lead to this same thing, but this sort of like very direct parallel, kind of like almost global, almost sort of American hegemonic export comes out. And now all of a sudden, again, global in the cosmopolitan socialist sense, we want everybody to be, cross-reading the best of all traditions. But I'm absolutely, I'm very unexcited about like Danish activists, importing, white fragility and other kind of bullshit like that. So I think it actually has a real potential of being a framework for like actual serious, rigorous diversity and globalism that points us into the actual particulars, not just in terms of like recognizing and seeing, but actually needing to do the work of reading, hearing, inquiring, going deep. And then on the other hand, the universal aspirations that everybody has. And I'd also say too, the last thing is that sounds all very, there is this kind of intellectual aspect of it, but I actually do think that there's, at their best, there are versions of this that are, much more matter of fact, that definitely emerge in certain working class zones, and definitely, and then also in the realm of pop culture. I mean, you see some, fucking alt-right asshole wearing some, I don't know, like a Nas shirt or something. It's like, and the cheap, and we all understand, of course, like, yes, absolutely, one can be enacting white supremacy in like hip hop, of course. Like we're past that kind of simplistic, the NBA is going to get rid of racism or whatever, obviously. But at the same time, you do also have to look and say, this is really, you are participating in the best of every culture you have access to and all that entails. But you really want to sell some kind of like, disgusting, embarrassing ethno-state thing. And I think honestly, if we just remind people
without Elmatic, you know what I mean?
Right, exactly.
It's like, I can't remember how many times I've listened to that record, right?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, and I just think like that's to me, like, even when you talk about like your students, it's like, what about a left that is open-minded, generous, spiritually inquisitive, mature, worldly, seriously and rigorously committed with all of these like heroes, you know, the truly heroic figures, Rosa Luxemburg or Lula or the ANC or whatever, and then also the cultural context of the best that really global culture has to offer. Just like, as an example, the African National Congress actually did pioneer cultural diplomacy through, you know, like Mariam Makeba as an example. I mean, this is just the best stuff. It honestly, it destroys the right. It makes various projects of technocratic liberalism or wokery look, you know, small, petty, and parochial, because they are.
Yeah, look, I completely agree with you, right? I mean, one of the things that I've really gotten from living in Mexico and having a Mexican wife is just realizing how much, if you have an open mind, you can learn from other people, right? Particularly, you know, my wife always says, you know, white food is pretty boring, and she's right, you know. So that's just one instance of where cosmopolitan socialism has inevitably or inexorably improved my life. But look, man, it
Yeah.
was really great speaking to you, right? I really enjoyed this, and people should definitely pick up your book. Again, it's Against the Web, with critique of the IDW, and also a lot more ruminations on cosmopolitan socialism. And look, thanks a lot. And like I said, this should be up soon. But
Thanks. Great talking with you, brother.
yeah,
Take care.
peace.
Peace.